Hello, I'm Michael Scott in Oxford in the UK. Welcome to the 28th event in our Zoom season, Cultural Encounters, Books That Have Made a Difference, where we are bringing together scholars and their audiences in order to explore themes of encounter in literary works and contemporary cultural debates. Today, our guest speaker is Professor John Ford Rescher from Georgetown University. John Ford Rescher, now Emeritus Professor of English at Georgetown University, taught there for 47 years, focusing some of his time and his energy on the teaching of courses on the Catholic imagination. His book, Jesus and the Emergence of a Catholic Imagination, was published by Paulist Press in 2008. His interesting and insightful reading of Robert Browning's 1850 poem, Christmas Eve and Easter Morning, as being in a tradition originating in medieval poetry, was published in The Christian Literary Imagination by Vernon Press in 2024. If any questions occur to you during this talk, please type them in using the Q&A button, not the chat button, the Q&A button, please, on your computer. Towards the end, I will ask as many questions as possible for our guest to answer. Please don't leave your questions till the last minute, as we may run out of time. And with that, over to you, John.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Michael, for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here today. I'm going to talk for a little bit more than a half hour and explore complicated issues having to do with the culture of encounter. And so I'll now begin. The cultural encounter of Americans with Europe is one of the central themes in the fiction of Henry James, and is a subject which spans his career, from Roderick Hudson, 1875, to The Ambassadors, 1903. James himself found himself particularly drawn to this problematic confrontation with two long novels, The American, 1877, and The Portrait of a Lady, 1881. And tucked in between those two is a much shorter novel, Daisy Miller, which first appeared in periodicals in 1878 and then in a book-length collection of works in 1879. The culture of encounter in this little book, it runs around 64 pages in length, is very limited and is presented in James' text through the fortunes of a family of American tourists, the Millers, who encounter expatriate Americans living in Switzerland and Italy, and who Switzerland and Italy, these expatriates, oddly comfortable aliens, have created for themselves a curious American/European culture of their own. Indeed, the tourists in Daisy Miller never encounter Swiss natives on the book's pages, and when they do meet Italians, they will be persons whose business is to exploit American tourists. Hence, James' treatment of what are essentially non-encounters is sometimes comic and ironic, sometimes intensely dramatic, and ultimately, for the book's eponymous heroine Daisy, tragic. Given this peculiar material, James' choice of the novel's focalizer, an expatriate American named Frederick Winterbourne, who, like James, had been largely educated in Europe and who now lives most of the time in Geneva, Switzerland, is particularly apt. And Winterbourne's limitations are crucial to the narrative. As Daisy Miller, the book, begins, the Millers are staying at the Trois Couronnes, a hotel which still exists today. And as the narrator describes it, one of the hotels at Vevey was famous, even classical, being distinguished from many of its upstart neighbors by an air both of luxury and of maturity. In this region, in the month of June, American travelers are extremely numerous. It may be said, indeed, that Vevey assumes at this period some of the characteristics of an American watering place. There are sights and sounds which evoke a vision, an echo of Newport and Saratoga. There's a flitting hither and thither of stylish young girls, a rustling of muslin flounces, a rattle of dance music in the morning hours, a sound of high-pitched voices at all times. Which is to say that the Miller family, who are in Switzerland, are staying in what is essentially a closed-off American world. The family turns out to be characteristic. The father, Ezra B., is not in Europe at all, remaining in Schenectady to make money. His wife, the putative head of the travelers, is feckless, negligent, and self-absorbed. She is but dimly aware of Europe, only speaking of it as a place where there are, quote, castles, many of them in Italy, and she only wishes to see, quote, the principal ones. In her longest speech of the novel, Mrs. Miller talks at length about her liver. I suffer from the liver, she announces, and she then goes on to praise a Dr. Davis, who, she asserts, stands first in Schenectady, of course. Her younger child, Randolph, insists his somatic problems, he can't sleep at night, he's lost all but 7 of his teeth, are the consequence of staying in what he calls this old Europe. What Randolph wants is candy, and he cadges 3 sugar cubes on the sly at the beginning of the book, lamenting that his mother denies him the only thing which matters to him. Whenever Randolph speaks of Europe, it is to assert that it is inferior to the United States. This unlikely pair accompany Daisy, whose actual name is Annie P., as her brother points out, who is physically attractive, excessively well-dressed, and vocal about her craving for attention from men. Daisy is one of James's American girls. The phrase is his, American girls, rebelliously independent, refusing advice and direction from other people, demanding and even defying social acceptance. What Daisy wants, as she declares, is fuss, that's her word, and to claim, and again her language, her habitual sense of freedom. In the novel's most dramatic scenes, she has complex reactions to rejection, which we will trace as one of the book's most important explorations of encounter. James makes no effort to account for Daisy's attitudes or her concept of herself. She seems to be without friends, even though she alludes to having some back in the States. She never makes a reference to a book or a periodical, and instead, as we will see, is continually absorbed in performing herself. She is clearly ignorant of European history and culture, and manifestly uninterested in learning anything from the experiences of Europe which she encounters. The Millers are accompanied by Eugenio, their courier, his name, elegant clothes, and his habitual cigarette smoking suggesting he's Italian. His role is primarily dictating rules for correct conduct to these ignorant Americans. And his authority is evidently based on his assumption that he is their superior because he is a European. The novel's slender plot begins when, during one pleasant morning, Warburton meets Randolph and then his sister in the hotel garden. And ignoring or perhaps unaware of European mores, Daisy quickly begins to talk with him without a proper introduction or a chaperone. And here's James. The young lady inspected her flounces and smoothed her ribbons, and Winterbourne presently risked an observation upon the beauty of the view. He was ceasing to be embarrassed, for he had begun to perceive that she wasn't in the least embarrassed herself. He saw that her glance was perfectly direct and unshrinking. It was not, however, what would have been called an immodest glance, for the young girl's eyes were singularly honest and fresh. Winterbourne, attracted to Daisy, keeps trying to classify her for himself as she speaks. She talked to Winterbourne as if she had known him a long time. He found it very pleasant. It might have been said that of this unknown young lady, who had come and sat down beside him upon a bench, that she chattered. She had ever so many intimate friends, and this is a paraphrase of her talk. She had ever so many intimate friends that had been there ever so many times, and then she had ever so many dresses and things from Paris. Whenever she put on a Paris dress, she felt as if she were in Europe. That's how Daisy talks to Winterbourne. Trying to figure out who Daisy is and what his relationship to her might be, Winterbourne turns to his aunt, a Mrs. Costello, who's a wealthy expatriate staying in the same hotel, and who both judges and imposes rules upon other people thanks to her membership in the exclusive American social circle at Vevey. He wishes to introduce Daisy to Mrs. Costello and to have her accepted, and his aunt refuses. And here's James's record of the dialogue between the aunt and nephew. They're very common, Mrs. Costello declared. They're the sort of Americans that one does one's duty by not accepting. Ah, you don't accept them? Said the young man. I can't, my dear Frederick. I would if I could, but I can't. The young girl's very pretty, said Winterbourne in a moment. Of course she's pretty, but she's very common. But my dear aunt, she's not, after all, a Comanche savage. She's a young lady, said Mrs. Costello, who has an intimacy with her mother's courier. And Frederick's aunt grimly predicts, you'll be sure to make some great mistake. You are too innocent. This exchange represents the struggle which Daisy will face, and an encounter which she will be denied in Switzerland. Her instinctive and constant freedom to act as she chooses directly opposes the expatriate culture which Mrs. Costello controls, and exclusion prompts with Daisy only further defiance. When Winterbourne tells Daisy of his aunt's refusal to meet her, Daisy's reaction is this. She doesn't want to know me, she said suddenly. Why don't you say so? You needn't be afraid. I'm not afraid. And she gave a little laugh. Winterbourne fancied there was a tremor in her voice. He was touched, shocked, mortified by it. My dear young lady, he protested, she knows no one. It's her wretched health. And a bit later, the young girl walked on a few steps, laughing still. You needn't be afraid, she repeated. Why should she want to know me? Then she paused again. She was close to the parapet of the garden, and in front of her was the starlit lake. Daisy Miller looked out upon the mysterious prospect, and then she gave another little laugh. Gracious, she is exclusive, she said. James' use at this moment of the mysterious prospect of Lake Leman, not named in the text, is a brilliantly suggestive symbol of Daisy's wished for celebrity and acceptance. And her little laugh articulates the fear her failure has generated. She's not going to be accepted. Instead of meeting Mrs. Costello, Daisy decides that she would like to cross the very same lake from their hotel to a European castle, Chillon, and she asks Winterbourne, who has offered, to take her there. For the first time, Daisy is encountering a known, indeed a historically significant European site, that old castle, as she calls it. Byron, in a long poem of 1816, The Prisoner of Chillon, had given broad currency to the story of Francois de Bonivard. His dates are 1493 to 1570, a Swiss Protestant rebel who had been imprisoned there with his brothers from 1530 to 1536, and whom Byron transforms into, sorry, folks, Byron transforms into a rebel, defying injustice and claiming his right to freedom. Here would be a moment for Daisy to encounter something she has never witnessed, and which could speak to her of her own demand for freedom of choice. That's Byron's hero. Winterbourne gets her to Chillon, but only after Daisy first meets him in the hotel lobby. Quote, where the couriers, the servants, the foreign tourists were lounging about and staring. At the moment, quote, they were all looking at her very hard, and she had begun to chatter as soon as she joined them. It's clear that this public performance of Daisy, quote, dressed in to the perfection of a soberly elegant traveling costume, is what she is seeking. And once across the lake and inside the castle of Chillon, and here's James describing, Daisy tripped about the vaulted chambers and rustled her skirts in the corkscrew staircases, flirted back with a pretty little cry and a shudder from the edge of the oubliettes, and turned a singularly well-shaped ear to everything that Winterbourne told her about the place. But he saw that she cared very little for the feudal antiquities, and that the dusky traditions of Chillon made but a slight impression upon her. Well, I hope you know enough, she said to her companion, after he had told her the history of the unhappy Bonivard. I never saw a man who knew so much. Daisy's flippant mockery of Winterbourne's modest knowledge of the history of Swiss Protestantism illustrates Daisy's refusal to encounter what is right in front of her, and instead her delight in the continuing performance of being herself. So much for Switzerland. Winterbourne returns to Geneva, then travels to Rome toward the end of January, where he first joins his imperious aunt, you all remember her, Mrs. Costello, again in her hotel room. She immediately fills him in on Daisy in Rome. The girl goes about alone with her foreigners. As to what happens further, you must apply elsewhere for the information. She has picked up about half a dozen of the regular Roman fortune hunters, and she takes them to people's houses. When she comes to a party, she brings with her a gentleman with a good deal of manner and a wonderful mustache. And where's the mother? I haven't the least idea. They are very dreadful people. That's Mrs. Costello. Winterbourne first meets the Miller family in the little crimson drawing room of Mrs. Walker on the Via Gregoriana. Mrs. Walker, the hostess, being an American lady, and, as the narrator tells us, a very accomplished woman. Here again, we have an expatriate American colony dominated by powerful middle-aged women, a closed-in, you never hear about any men in these groups, a closed-in culture which is present in Rome but seems to have very little to do with Italy and Italians. As Mrs. Costello has already warned, Daisy is trying to enter into, indeed, one might say, invade this usually tightly closed world and has the audacity to bring along young Roman men whom Mrs. Costello immediately has classified as fortune hunters. In the novel's longest and most fully developed scene, Daisy decides to stroll one afternoon through the Pincinian Garden, which is directly beyond the Villa Borghese, a very famous place still today, in order to meet her current, quote, clever and, quote, perfectly lovely, these are her words, Mr. Giovanelli. And she asks Winterbourne to accompany her. Abashed at being drawn into this very imprudent escapade, he acquiesces. In the midst of the traditional late afternoon Roman passeggiata, and here now we get James' description, the slow-moving, idly gazing Roman crowd bestowed much attention on the extremely pretty young foreign lady who was passing through it upon Winterbourne's arm. And he wondered what on earth had been in Daisy's mind when she proposed to expose herself. Note the language, eh? Expose herself unattended to its appreciation. His own mission, to her sense, apparently, was to consign her to the hands of Mr. Giovanelli. But Winterbourne, at once annoyed and gratified, resolved he would do no such thing. In fact, he is forced to. James's language creates a deliberate parallel between Daisy exposing herself before the languid, idle Roman crowd who are closely scrutinizing her. We needn't go into details. And the crowded hotel lobby back at Vevey. In both cases, there's a kind of menace in the cruel gaze of European strangers, which Daisy seems almost to court and to relish. And again, in this second version, Winterbourne is being used as a kind of adjunct performer, enabling Daisy to do just what she wants. This time, it's to take her to her latest Italian, quote unquote, gentleman. Soon, Winterbourne finds himself being introduced to a figure from central casting, Giovanelli, whose name is a comic version of Little God, who has, quote, a brilliant smile, an intelligent eye, and chats with, quote, the idiom he had practiced upon a great many American heiresses, polite nonsense, even as he strives to appear, quote, extremely urbane. Winterbourne finds himself forced to join this couple as they stroll on. And at this moment, you remember our friend Mrs. Walker from the Via, uh, uh, from the Via Gregoriana. Mrs. Walker uh, appears in her carriage. Um, she is shocked and horrified at the social risk Daisy is taking with this stroll, one arm, a gentleman on both sides with everybody watching. She cries out, it's a pity to let the girl ruin herself. That's Mrs. Walker. She tries to force Daisy to leave the two men and get into her carriage, with her asking Winterbourne to advise Daisy to do so. And he does go along with Mrs. Walker, and he very gently says to Daisy, I think you should get into the carriage. And here's James. The young girl looked at him more gravely, but with eyes that were prettier than ever. I've never allowed a gentleman to dictate to me or to interfere with anything I do. I think you've made a mistake, said Winterbourne. You should sometimes listen to a gentleman, the right one. Daisy began to laugh again. I do nothing but listen to gentlemen, she exclaimed. Tell me if Mr. Giovanelli is the right one? The back and forth continues. And finally, it's Mrs. Walker who is trying to get Daisy into the carriage. And now we have the climactic moment. Note the language. Daisy gave a violent laugh. I never heard anything so stiff. If this is improper, Mrs. Walker, she pursued, then I am all improper, and you must give me up. Goodbye. I hope you'll have a lovely ride. And with Mr. Giovanelli, who made a triumphantly obsequious salute, Daisy turned away. To Winterburn's advice, then Winterburn offers advice to Mrs. Walker. Well, your earnestness has only offended her and put her off. Mrs. Walker replies, it has happened very well. If she is so perfectly determined to compromise herself, the sooner one knows it, the better. One can act accordingly. The Roman crowd and Giovanelli constitute the novel's way of presenting Rome and Romans. And it's not a terribly flattering picture, which James is providing the reader. And already threading its way through conversations are references to malaria or Roman fever, the frequently fatal disease which in James' day was understood to be translated by the bad air, the literal translation of malaria, rising from the swamps and ruin-filled landscape of the city of Rome. Daisy typically laughs at warnings of this danger with offhand remarks such as, we're going to stay all winter if we don't die of the fever, and I guess we'll stay then. Continuing her audacity during the next days, Daisy comes, quite late, to a party at Mrs. Walker's rooms, bringing Giovanelli, of course, with her. Winterburn, taking Daisy aside, tries to warn her about her conduct. Though you may be flirting, Mr. Giovanelli is not. He means something else. He isn't preaching at any rate, said Daisy with vivacity. And if you want very much to know, we are neither of us flirting. We are too good friends for that. We are very intimate friends. Ah, rejoined Winterburn. If you're in love with each other, it's another affair. She had allowed him up to this point to talk so frankly that he had no expectation of shocking her by this ejaculation, but she immediately got up, blushing visibly, and leaving him to exclaim mentally that little American flirts were the queerest creatures in the world. Mr. Giovanelli, at least, she said, giving her interlocutor a single glance, never says such disagreeable things to me. As Daisy begins to leave the party, Mrs. Walker, and here's James, turned her back straight on Miss Miller and left her to depart with what grace she might. Winterburn was standing near the door. He saw it all. Daisy turned very pale and looked at her mother, but Mrs. Miller was humbly unconscious of any violation of the usual social forms. That was very cruel, Winterburn said to Mrs. Walker. She never enters my drawing room again, replied his hostess. This very public shaming of Daisy, known as cutting, exiles her permanently from American expatriate society in Rome. No respectable person will have anything to do with it. But undeterred, Daisy keeps on with her campaign. What follow are a series of scenes in which Winterburn, now forced to the sidelines, observes Daisy as she continues her performances. In St. Peter's Basilica, for example. Here, Winterburn joins his aunt, Mrs. Costello, and the two of them see Daisy from a distance. Here's James. Winterburn perceived Daisy strolling about the great church in company with the inevitable Giovanelli. Presently, he pointed out the young girl and her cavalier to Mrs. Costello. Mrs. Costello inspected the young couple again with her optical instrument. I think James means looking glass. He's very handsome. One easily sees how it is. She thinks him the most elegant man in the world, the finest gentleman. He is, apparently, a perfectly respectable little man. I believe he is, in a small way, a cavaliere avvocato, but he doesn't move in what are called the first circles. I think it is really not absolutely impossible that the courier introduced him. This assumption turns out to be confirmed later in the novel. No one in this scene makes reference to the Michelangelo Pietà, the Bernini Baldacchino, or the distant chanting of the Sistine Chapel choir. And self-evidently, the only Italian is Giovanelli, continuing his flirtation with Daisy. Soon Daisy and Giovanelli become such a common sight that one of Winterburn's friends notes them visiting the famous Doria Palace and its nook. His friend talked for a moment about the superb portrait of Innocent X by Velasquez, which hangs in one of the cabinets of the palace, and then said, and in the same cabinet, by the way, I had the pleasure of contemplating a picture of a different kind, that pretty American girl whom you pointed out to me last week. In answer to Winterburn's inquiries, his friend narrated that the pretty American girl, prettier than ever, was seated with a companion in the secluded nook in which the great papal portrait was enshrined. It's still there today, by the way, in the 25th century. 21st century. Days later, Winterburn encounters the couple again on the Palatine Hill. Here's James. Daisy was strolling along the top of one of those great mounds of ruin that are embanked with mossy marble and paved with monumental inscriptions. Giovanelli was at her side, and Giovanelli, too, wore an aspect of even unwonted brilliancy. Well, said Daisy, talking to Winterburn, I should think you would be lonesome. Lonesome? Asked Winterburn. You're always going around by yourself. Can't you get anyone to walk with you? I'm not so fortunate, said Winterburn, as your companion. By now the reader is comfortably aware that Daisy is ignorant as to where she is walking and what she is seeing, and that she is uninterested in achieving any encounter with Roman history. However, to qualify that, the book then turns to its quite climactic, quintessentially Roman scene, and here Daisy finally evinces a teasingly momentary glimpse of Italian history. She's finally connecting. The location is the center of the Colosseum, and a touristic tradition which had gained a kind of immortality, again, thanks to Byron. You notice how Byron has come up with the castle at Chillon and now again with the Colosseum. Because in Byron's long closet poem, Manfred, closet drama Manfred, he pictures the experience of visiting this scene of gladiatorial fighting and Christian martyrdom by moonlight. It had become a custom. That's what you're supposed to do when you're in Rome. The Colosseum by moonlight. The poet celebrates this moment as leaving that beautiful, which still was so, and making that which was not beautiful, beautiful, until the place, the Colosseum, became religion, and the heart ran o'er with silent worship of the great of old. Christian piety had by Daisy's era erected a large cross in the center of the arena. to memorialize the fallen faithful. And it's there that our wandering Winterbourne, with Byron's lines echoing in his memory, finds Daisy. And here's James. The great cross in the center was covered with shadow. It was only as he drew near it that he made it out distinctly. Then he saw that two persons were stationed upon the low steps which formed its base. One of these was a woman seated. Her companion was standing in front of her. Presently, the sound of the woman's voice came to him distinctly in the warm night air. Well, he looks at us as one of the old lions or tigers may have looked at the Christian martyrs. Why, it was Mr. Winterbourne. He saw me, and he cuts me. Daisy hasn't forgotten Mrs. Walker's spurning, and now, with unjust and exaggerated blame, foists it on Winterbourne. He's not intending to cut them, who joins them as James describes the scene. Daisy, lovely in the flattering moonlight, looked at him a moment. Then, all the evening, she answered gently, I never saw anything so pretty. I'm afraid, said Winterbourne, that you will not think Roman fever very pretty. This is the way people catch it. I wonder, he added, turning to Giovanelli, that you, a native Roman, should countenance such a terrible indiscretion. Ah, said the handsome native, for myself, I am not afraid. Neither am I, says Winterbourne, for you. I am speaking for this young lady. Giovanelli lifted his well-shaped eyebrows and showed his brilliant teeth. But he took Winterbourne's rebuke with docility. I told the signorina it was a grave discretion, but when was the signorina ever prudent? I never was sick, and I don't mean to be, the signorina declared. Daisy's American-bred audacity, which has carried us through so much, is finally not equal to Roman malaria. Within 2 days, she is dying, and feverishly she sends warm Winterbourne a message via her mother that she had never been engaged to Giovanelli, who, as Mrs. Miller dimly observed, hasn't been near us since she was taken ill. All of which leads to the book's final, sadly ironic Roman encounter, which Daisy experiences, indeed having scoffingly anticipated outside the city walls. Daisy's grave was in the little Protestant cemetery in an angle of the wall of Imperial Rome, beneath the cypresses and the thick spring flowers. Winterbourne stood there beside it. Giovanelli, who's present for the internment, was very pale. On this occasion, he had no flower in his buttonhole. He seemed to wish to say something. At last, he said, she was the most beautiful young lady I ever saw, and the most amiable. And then he added in a moment, and she was the most innocent. Damn it. Sorry, folks. She was the most innocent. If she had lived, I should have got nothing. She would never have married me, I'm sure. She would never have married you? Winterbourne asks. Giovanelli replies, For a moment I hoped so, but no, I'm sure. Winterbourne listened to him. He stood staring at the raw protuberance among the April daisies. When he turned away again, Mr. Giovanelli, with his light, slow step, had retired. And thus the Italy of the novel exits. I find it interesting that that word innocent is used in Giovanelli's final speech, because he may have been thinking of the painting of Innocent, which they had seen in the Doria Pamphili Museum. She was the most innocent. James' novel was to quickly become popular. It was his first marked success with his English language readers. So absorbed was he in the themes, issues, and problems it presents that he quickly turned to writing the full dress 600-page The Portrait of a Lady, to work through them in a far more complex and indeed ambiguous way. But for some, the wistful vision of the raw protuberance among the April daisies remains the most telling memory. So the title that I chose for this presentation, which is I Am All Improper, You Must Give Me Up, signals Daisy's attitude and what she is pursuing. And I see my dear friend Michael Scott here, and it's time for a discussion.
Well, let's thank you, John. That's just a beautiful lecture, you know.
Thank you.
Uh,
I'm Mike Collins.
Really, really getting to the heart of this this amazing book. In a sense, all the time that you're talking, I'm wondering about the word allegory. What is that? What's the allegory there? Where's he moving to? What's he wanting us to see underneath this story? What is the philosophy that is going on here?
Well, it seems to me, and it's a tricky book, isn't it? I mean, there's a lot to be said about it that I didn't say. Um, Daisy is exemplifying attitudes about the freedom of persons to evaluate and judge, and the refusal to accept the notion that there's a kind of order of knowledge, that there is a canonic sort of beauty and history that everybody should master and then be influenced by. It's a kind of turning away from that and an insisting on what is exciting and fun for her. Um, I must say that in the years that I taught, and Michael Collins will understand this, Georgetown students in Florence, many of them were Daisy Millers. That is to say, they were in Florence for the gelato and a couple of beers at the Fiddler's Elbow, and not terribly interested in as my ladling out all kinds of books about Italian history and culture. And they were very happy in having the Italy that they had come looking for. Does that make sense in a way? And Daisy comes to, I mean, Daisy's been dragged to Italy by the family, but what she wants to do is perform. She wants to be Daisy Miller, and she is. And then the grim part of the book is, of course, this becomes reckless and leads to her death.
John, what do you make of the ending? The line is, hold on now. No, I'm on the wrong page. One, where is it? She sent me a message before her death,
Yeah.
but I have understood it since. She said one would have appreciated one's esteem.
Yeah. It's very strange. Winterbourne, who lives in Geneva, the center of Calvinism in
Yeah.
Switzerland, Um, and in the novel, we are teasingly told that he is in Geneva, pursuing an older woman. Seems to be fascinated by the possibility that Daisy might become a romantic possibility for him, and yet she never is. And he fails in all of his efforts to ingratiate himself with her. Um, and so he goes back to Geneva. Uh, and and Michael, the phrase that you used, get my copy here. Have appreciated one's esteem, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and that's to Mrs. Costello. Um, and then in the very next little paragraph, Winterbourne sadly says to his aunt, "You were right in that remark you made last summer. I was booked to make a mistake." I did quote that line in my presentation. "I've lived too long in foreign parts." He made a mistake. He didn't connect with Daisy. I think that's what it meant.
Because he's locked into the culture of Mrs. Costello.
I think you're right. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm asking now. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. Yeah. And esteem is a kind of, it's an inadequate word.
Yeah.
It in no way embraces what the book is about.
As you were describing that world, it made me think of the world that a generation later, Charles Augustus Strong and that gang of people, Vernon Lee and Edith Wharton, all those Americans who lived in Italy, and as far as we could tell from our experience at the villa, they had nothing to do with the Italians.
Yeah.
They had their own enclosed world. That Charles Strong, who owned the Villa Le Balze, was a pupil of William James, so he was a generation later. But it seems like that culture of, the American colony continued at least for another generation.
Yeah, yeah. And you could even say that Berenson in I Tatti, while he's studying Italian art, it's not living Italians are very interesting to him. It's more 14th century Italian
Yes.
that,
Yeah.
that attracts his and the as Michael and I know, with the two Michaels and I know, these Americans would build very nice homes for themselves with large libraries of almost entirely English language books, and then they would spend their days and nights reading English, right?
Yeah. Yes.
And not Italian writing.
Can I go to another quotation? Really, this is from Geoffrey Moore, and in his introduction to to Daisy Miller,
Hmm.
and he says, like Huckleberry Finn, who took a stand against society by helping Jim to escape, and thus spoke out about slavery, Daisy strikes a blow for the ultimately to be liberated female, who may flout the rule of as much as she wishes because her intentions are honest.
Very important, isn't it? I've spent a month reading The Portrait of a Lady with two groups, one Georgetown retirees and another group of people here in Arlington, Virginia. And Michael, what James went on to do in that much bigger book is to explore exactly what you're talking about. And with Isabel Archer, he creates a woman who very consciously decides to insist, as Daisy does, on her own judgments about things. Um, and she actually echoes words by Thoreau, who decided to live life deliberately, and Isabel Archer intends to choose to live her life deliberately, and she runs into all kinds of problems also in that book, which, by the way, is an extraordinary masterpiece. It's wonderful. I spent a whole month reading and talking about it with folks, and it was a delight from start to finish. Um, and she is tricked, Isabel Archer, by an expatriate American who lives in Florence and in Rome, and who marries her just to get her fortune. And then it has a very, very difficult life as a consequence of that. So James continues to work with the problems we're talking about. That is to say, on the one hand, these young American women wish to assert their freedom to choose. Isabel's very clear about that, and so is Daisy, but it runs them into difficulties in Europe, and in both cases. For Daisy, it's fatal. For Isabel Archer, it's just she marries the wrong guy and is very unhappy. And
John, that word innocence that
yeah,
Giovanelli uses, it has such resonance in the American context. The innocent hero,
yeah,
Huckleberry Finn, young Goodman Brown, Nick Adams, even Gatsby, whose anniversary we are celebrating. There's a certain innocence about the American, and what the way I often think about James is innocent bumps into experience, and that takes a great and then that takes us a great deal about the differences, the idea that the Americans don't understand original sin, and the Europeans understand it all too well. There's a it is, and Twain, of course, Innocents Abroad.
yeah.
And
And of course, you're echoing Blake, right? The
yep.
poems of innocence and experience, where they're set against each other, right? Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest.
Yeah.
Who
Yeah.
who can account for your fearful symmetry? Says
Yeah.
Blake, and there's no answer, is there?
Mm.
Uh, to that question. I mean,
Also, thinking of Hawthorne, the Marble Fawn, same
yeah,
story, which probably James pilfered from Hawthorne anyway.
and must have known. Yeah,
Yeah,
I used to take Georgetown kids through that book too. That's a
yeah,
wonderful,
that's a
crazy book.
wonderful book.
Yeah, yeah.
Blake even says dares, uses the word dares,
Mm.
doesn't he? You know,
Who does know?
Blake, in a,
Blake.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, who dares,
Who dares? That's right.
who
Exactly.
dare,
Yeah, yeah. You're
yeah,
absolutely right. The
yeah.
physical symmetry.
What about Henry James though himself, as an American who comes to Europe,
Hmm.
comes to England, comes to Europe, visits Europe a lot,
Mhm.
um, uh, and actually takes British nationality in 2015.
Show loyalty to Britain during the that terrible war.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah.
He's a fascinating figure, isn't he? Uh, During the time that he was working on Daisy Miller, he was moving about, which was his wont, um, from Britain. He had an address in London, but down to Paris, to Florence, and to Rome, where in each place he had close friends, and he um, he was a very close friend of Turgenev, the
Mm,
Russian writer, and they
mhm.
met in Paris and lunched together and talked about their writings. And Turgenev, during the time of the writing of Daisy Miller, I think was having quite a strong influence on James. He also knew Flaubert, um, and corresponded with him, so that James was connected with some of the most important writers of fiction of the 70s and 80s, and these men liked him and respected his work. Um, but I know James felt that the novel before Daisy Miller was, he said it was kind of thin. Then came Daisy, and then came The Portrait of a Lady, which which I think everybody regards as one of his most important books. So Daisy Miller is a kind of a transitional project. And as I said in my remarks, and this is actually quite important for as we talk about James, it was immediately popular and sold. And since he was self-supporting, he had family money, but he was always worried about making money from his writing. Daisy Miller was a kind of a threshold moment for him, and carried him forward in a very positive way.
This whole business about Italy and novelists, I mean, it actually goes back to the Unfortunate Traveller and Thomas Nash. You know,
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
Englishman Italianate is the devil incarnate. You
Yeah.
know,
Yes.
that aspect of looking at it. Well, I think. Have you got any other questions, Mike? You want to?
No, I'm
Right.
fine, thank you.
Okay, I think John, that's been a fascinating hour. Thank you very much
Thank you.
indeed. And
It was a great honor to be invited. Thank you very much.
can I today thank Georgetown University for supporting this series, especially the Vice President Global Affairs, Tom Banchoff. Thanks also to the administrator at Georgetown, Mary Gordon. Thank Mike, as ever, for helping us with this and supporting this series. I'd like to thank at Blackfriars Hall Dominic White, the prior, John O'Connor, the regent, Richard Finn, the director of the Las Casas Institute, and the UK administrator, John Angus Macaulay. I'm Mike Scott. I'm from Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. You can follow me on LinkedIn as Professor Michael Scott or on Facebook as Michael Kerr Scott. Thanks for joining us today. Thank you again, John.
Thank you, John.
Mike.
Great to be with you. Okay.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Arrivederci.
Bye-bye.
Arrivederci.